Hello, my name is Curtis Lockhart. I'm the founder and executive director of the Africa Urban Lab, or AUL. We're a research center and a policy lab housed at the African School of Economics, Zanzibar. At the AUL, we're focused on rapid urbanization across Africa and how we can harness that urbanization for economic growth. As part of this work, the AUL runs the AUL Working Paper Series, which highlights frontier research on some of the most important and impactful urban policy questions facing African cities today. And given the AUL is a policy lab, we're also really interested in how this research translates into policy action in the real world on the ground in African cities. As part of this working paper series, each published working paper is accompanied by a virtual presentation on the paper from the authors, which is why we're here today. Today's paper is titled Modeling Land Values in African Cities with Open Data and Machine Learning. And for those interested in reading more, we have a link to the paper in this video's description below. To present the paper today, we're joined by one of its authors, Felix Egimang. Felix is a lecturer in spatial data science in the Department of Planning, Property and Environmental Management at the University of Manchester. And he's also, very importantly, a fellow here at the Africa Urban Lab, and we're super happy to have him on board. He completed his PhD at the University of Cambridge, and his research sits right at the intersection of urbanization, spatial data science, and machine learning. So he's the perfect person to present today. And the paper he's presenting today is co-authored with Sean Fox of the University of Bristol. So with that, Felix, first of all, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Curtis. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So just as Felix cues up his slides for the agenda for today, Felix has about 30 to 40 minutes of a slide presentation that he'll walk us through, presenting the main takeaways from the paper. So let him get that queued up. And then after the slides, we'll move on to a Q&A with me asking Felix some questions. So without further ado, Felix, feel free to take it away whenever you're ready.
Yeah, thank you, Curtis. Right, thank Curtis once again for the introduction. Felix Egimang with the University of Manchester and also a fellow of the AUL. This afternoon, I'm talking about modeling land values in African cities with open data and machine learning. So why do we even have to bother ourselves about land values data? Well, as an urban scientist, I always start from the science. It's important for urban science. And there are lots of classical and contemporary models in urban science, popular being, for instance, the bed rent by Alonso Mills and also Von Thunel's model. All of them rely heavily on land rent. So for urban science sake, we need land values data. But of course, this lab is more about policy. It goes beyond urban science, translating research to policy action. And on that front, land values data is important for revenue mobilization, mobilizing resources to fund infrastructure in cities that are urbanizing. At the base of revenue mobilization of most cities is valuation and property taxation. And land values is instrumental to both taxation and property valuation. So yeah, in terms of funding infrastructure in cities in Africa, land values would play an important role. And for that matter, it's also instrumental to public policy, very important as to formulating policies about space, what should go where. That is also important. Land values is important for that as well. So land values has these three key importance. Of course, beyond these, there are also other important. I'd like to dwell on these three. The current state of land values data in African cities, it's not great, to put it mildly. There is scarcity of data. Land values data in many African cities is very scarce to come across, very difficult to come across land values data in African cities. And a few data that you would come across in most African cities are incomplete. Many records will be missing in the data set and also mostly outdated. Very rare would you access recent land values data or up-to-date land values data in many African cities. And the few that also exist, highly inaccessible if you don't have good networks with administrative units in African cities. Very difficult to access data. They are not openly basically accessible. So these are the challenges confronting African cities with regards to land values data. Despite its importance, the takeaway here is that land values data are difficult to access in many African cities. But the picture is not all gloomy because there are promising trends, especially at the global level. And these are the promising trends. So over the past few decades, we've had advancements in computing techniques. Computing power has increased considerably. And that is a promising trend. We will soon know why that is a promising trend. Remote sensing has also improved significantly over the past few decades. Now we have a lot more satellite data at high spatial resolution, better satellite data that are freely available or openly accessible, being available. For instance, we have Sentinel-2, 10-meter resolution that is now available, and even some that are that have higher spatial resolution are increasingly getting openly accessible. We also have lots of volunteered geographic information. So all of us are contributing to building geospatial database or geospatial data. I'm sure many of you may have heard of OSM, which is a volunteer geographic information. That is also increasingly becoming available or becoming more available. And the online housing market, so in quite a number of African cities, this is quite a recent trend. The online housing market is getting better and better. A lot more people are selling their properties or renting their properties using digital platforms, using online platforms. So that online market is also getting better by the day. So these are promising trends, right? So the picture is not gloomy. That's the takeaway here. So with the challenges of land values data in mind, and also the promising trends on the other hand, the goal of this research is to develop a method for estimating land values data in African cities. So how do we estimate land values? And the method has to be accessible, has to be affordable, as in low cost, and it has to be scalable. So beyond the case study cities, we should be able to apply to different cities in Africa as well, and also functional. So it has to do the job that it is meant to do. So these are the 4 key characteristics of the method that we're introducing for estimating land values in African cities: accessible, affordable, scalable, and functional. So then we leverage on the online housing market, as I mentioned earlier on, that it's getting better. So the online housing market, the rental market dominates in many African cities. Very few people are able to buy their homes. A lot more people rent. So that is also a signature of the online housing market. You see a lot of property listings being up for rent compared to those that are listed for sale. Then we have very few major platforms that dominate in many cities. So these are the key characteristics of the online housing market in our case study cities, which is Accra and Nairobi. So actually, Accra and Nairobi are the case study cities. We will learn more about these cities as we go along. So property listings, the online property listings in many African cities, it's actually noisy. It's one of the barriers or the challenges that we'll be looking at and how we could overcome that. So when you go looking for property listings data as in the online data, you go looking for something like this, right? Very posh car like this. But in reality, this is what you get. You get something that is quite messy. What that means is you have to do some cleaning, data cleaning, as in work on the data, to get it in a format that is usable, that could be inputted into a model to give you a useful prediction, really. So the point here is that the online housing market isn't perfect. The data there comes with a lot of noise that needs to be cleaned in most instances to get it to a place where you could use it for your modeling work. And that is what we did in our case. So after extracting the online property listings data, we had to then geolocate it. So within Accra and Nairobi, we should be able to geolocate where the property listings are coming from, and within that, and these maps shows the areas that we have geolocated the property listings. So in our model, we're trying to predict land values, and to do that, we need some variables to help us do that. And the variables are classified into three: so local amenities, and local amenities here we're talking about local infrastructure, be it economic and social. So what we do is that we extract data, points of interest data from OSM, and then we classify some as economic and some as social. So we then generate the count of economic and social amenities in small areas. Here, small areas refer to grid cells. So we take each city, then we divide the city into 500 meter by 500 meter grid cells. And then for each grid cell, we then count the number of economic and social infrastructure amenities as extracted from OpenStreetMap. Then we also generate the neighborhood characteristics of each cell. So we construct a buffer of 1 kilometer radius around each grid cells, and within that, we also compute the density of economic and social infrastructure, because that, by theory, it's important, for understanding land values, or for predicting land values, and also the population density and nighttime light. We use nighttime light data, or radiance data as well. And then we use features that we extract from daytime satellites. So we have satellite imageries, and we then use deep learning. This is where AI comes in. So deep learning is basically AI. We use AI to extract features from the daytime satellite imagery. And what that approximates is building characteristics. So if you have a photo, a satellite photo, you would see built-up footprint, basically the buildings constituting the built-up. AI, we use AI to extract features from the footprint, which also goes into the model. So these are the key predictors in the model that we construct. Earlier on, I mentioned that the economic and social infrastructure data is something that comes from OpenStreetMap. Remember, the title is modeling land values with open data. So all the data sets we're using are openly available, freely available, publicly available, however you want to express it. Anyone can access it because you want to develop a method that is low cost, simple, scalable, and affordable. So what we did was we classified the points of interest data from OSM into economic, social, or other. So when you have points of interest like banks, ATMs, markets, retail, those that are more economic in nature, we classify them as economic. And the ones to do with education, health, governmental facilities, those are classified as social infrastructure. So a bit of the data. And in terms of our model, so this is a very brief model architecture. I wouldn't spend a lot of time here. So we have the model inputs, which includes the daytime satellite imagery, which we use AI, we use a convolutional neural network, which is a deep learning model to extract the features from the daytime satellite imagery. Then alongside the economic and social infrastructure data that we extract from OpenStreetMap, and together with population density and nighttime lights, and of course the online housing market data, which is the rental, the geocoded property listings data, basically of rental prices, which is what we're trying to predict. So these are our inputs. We put them into our machine learning model. The machine learning model here is ensemble learning, which is random forest. We use random forest ensemble learning. Now I didn't spend so much time here, but it's a form of machine learning that we used, and that's quite popular. So we use that to then predict land values. So what we do is we hold out 20% of the data. So we don't show 20% of the data to the model. We only use 80% to train the model. Then we ask the model to predict for the 20% that it hasn't seen. So that is a form of validation, because we need to be able to assess the performance of the model. So the validation bit is basically asking the model to predict for the 20% that it has not seen. And then we assess whether the performance of the model in predicting land values or predicting rental price in this context in both cities, Accra and Nairobi, is good or not. So before running the model, we had to make a decision. Do we train one model for Accra and Nairobi? Or do we train the model in Accra and also train the model in Nairobi? To make the decision, we looked at the relationship between our predictors. Then we realized that if you take the log price, so if you take log price, I don't know if my kids are showing, but basically, if you look at this correlation chart, if you look at Accra, take the first column here, and then compare the first column to that of Nairobi. What we realize is that the relationship between price and the predictors slightly differ depending on the city. So you don't have same relationship between the rental price and the predictors for Accra and Nairobi. For some of them, for many of them, the relationship differs, which then means that local training of the model is important. So we then train the model for Accra and also train the model for Nairobi. All right. Now let's see how the model performs. So we train the model firstly using all the predictors, but holding out the satellite, the features we extracted from satellite image. Remember, I mentioned daytime satellite image and using AI, deep learning model, to extract features from the satellite imagery. So we held out that bit. Okay, let's train the model, but we'll not add the AI component, the one that we use the AI, the features that we use AI to extract. Let's not add that to the model and see what the model does just with the OSM, with the OpenStreetMap data. And this is the results we get in Accra. We're able to explain 54% of the variance in land values in rental price here. So here, when I say land values, I'm using rental price to represent that. And in the case of Nairobi, we explain up to 45% of the variance in rental price. Then we move a step further to add the satellite, the features we extracted from daytime satellite imagery using AI. Okay, so now we are using all the predictors, and the ones from OSM data, the OpenStreetMap data, and then the features extracted from satellite imagery, daytime satellite imagery. So we add all of that, and this is what we see. We see the performance of the model increase significantly. In the case of Accra, the R-squared increases by about 14% from 0.54, from 54% of the variance to explaining 61% of the variance. And in the case of Nairobi, it even increases more considerably by about a third or so, increasing from explaining 45% of the variance to almost 60% of the variance. So here we see stability, across both cities, Accra and Nairobi, both models doing quite well, doing about 60% of the variance. We're explaining 60% of the variance. If you map that spatially, if you map the prediction of the model with what is observed, and then you classify that into quartiles, this is what we see. You can see in the maps that the maps are very, very similar. If you look at Accra, for instance, what is observed and what is predicted, what the model is predicting, the patterns that emerge is very, very similar, highly similar to the patterns we observe. So the predicted one is basically the 20% that the model predicted versus what actually exists. Same case for Nairobi, very similar patterns between prediction and observed. So we dig further to understand which factors or which predictors are helping us, explain most of the variance in the performance of the model. And we realized that the satellite imagery, that the features we extracted from the satellite imagery actually plays an important role. So for instance, in the case of Accra, in the case of Nairobi, before going into this a bit further, let me state that we extracted two features from the satellite imageries of each city. So two features for Accra, two features for Nairobi. In the case of Accra, so in the case of Nairobi, the first feature is the most influential predictor in the case of Accra. population density is the most influential predictor. But even so, the first feature which we extracted from the satellite imagery and the second feature are all important, play key role. So basically, the longer the bar, the more influential the feature is. So that is the point to take away here. The takeaway here is that we go in the extra layer or the extra step of using AI to extract to extract features from satellite imagery, actually improves the performance of the model or improves our ability to predict land values in Africa. So the point is, using AI to extract satellite features matters. That's the takeaway from this slide. So what does it mean? What does this results mean? What it means is that we can generate reasonably accurate, especially explicit rental price estimates in African cities using open data and machine learning. So all the data we've used, openly accessible, and we are explaining up to 60% of the variance in rental price in Accra, and also similar percentage in Nairobi. So just using openly accessible data alongside machine learning, we can explain with reasonable accuracy the variance in rental price in these two cities. And we also realize that satellite imagery is extracted with AI matters. It helps us to improve the performance of the models. So it means the satellite imageries are capturing some features that we are not able to see, we are not able to observe physically. It's like maybe building density, layout, and much more. But basically the point is that the satellite imagery are capturing something that are important for explaining the variance in land values. And also the importance of local context, right? So the bivariate correlation charts that I showed earlier on shows that the relationship between rental price and the predictors actually differ depending on the city. We use two cities in this context. So what that means is that training the model locally, it's important, okay? So you don't just stick with the model as a broad brush and then start painting every city, but rather you have to understand the city nuances and at least train the model locally before using it to make predictions. From a policy perspective, which is very, very important, what this shows is that this approach has potential to facilitate revenue mobilization in African cities. Okay, so we can use this approach as the initial layer, as the first cut to estimate rental prices, land values, and then further validated by some, follow-up data collection by local authorities in African cities. So takeaway here is that in terms of revenue mobilization, this approach could play an important role, and it's a low-cost, scalable, accessible approach, which has potential for facilitating revenue mobilization in data poor context, as we see in many African cities. So in terms of scaling up this approach, there are opportunities, but there are also barriers. And there are some suggestions as to how we could potentially overcome those barriers. So opportunities are that the approach is transferable. It can be transferred to other cities. The model could be trained in other cities and could be used to then generate predictions within the city or within the country, to within cities within the country. So it's geographically transferable. And beyond residential uses, it could also be applied to other land uses, non-residential uses like commercial uses, mixed uses, industrial uses. Once we understand the predictors that are important for those uses, we could use a similar setup. We could use a similar approach to quantify rental prices or even sale prices for those non-residential users as well. So this potential really exists. There are barriers, and the barriers include underdevelopment of the online housing market. So for some cities, might be quite a number of cities really in Africa, the online housing market is not that developed. There are still a lot more manual transactions that are not captured online. And in many cases, the property listings online are not structured. So like I mentioned earlier on, accessing that data comes with, some work, structuring the data, standardizing the data. And in many African cities too, the coverage of OpenStreetMap data is quite limited. So that then challenges the scalability of the model. So these are barriers that stand in the way of scaling up the model to many different cities in Africa. But those barriers could be overcome. Those barriers could we could improve. We could overcome those barriers really. And one of the things we could do really, or most cities in Africa could do, or city governments in Africa could do, is invest in digital development and also developing the online housing market. Encouraging basically more transactional, incentivizing online transactions when it comes to buying home and also renting home. So deliberately investing in that market would also mean that we'd have a lot more data available, really, to estimate land values and mobilize revenue, really, for financing infrastructure. So yeah, you invest in the digital online market, and then you also get something back, perhaps even in terms of value, something of higher value back in terms of revenue mobilization and infrastructure finance. And also developing a digital geodatabase for land transaction that is also openly accessible is quite important. At the moment, it's very difficult, like we saw earlier on, accessing land transaction database in African cities, very, very difficult. If African cities or if city governments also prioritize developing a geodatabase for land transactions, then what that means is we could even train better models, or the accuracy of the models could, the performance of the models would get better because we'd have a lot more data to train and also to validate the models and improve our estimation of land values, and that would also improve the ability of city governments to capture the value, to mobilize revenue and finance the much needed infrastructure. There's a lot more education that needs to be done when it comes to volunteer geographical data or volunteer geographical information. So OSM data, for instance, is basically people who are concerned about their places uploading data about their places onto a server that is freely accessible to all. But education about that is very limited in many African cities. A lot of people that are concerned about their places don't even know how to upload data about their places to the online server, which then will become available not just for the researchers, but also for city governments to use to estimate land values in this instance and to improve revenue mobilization. So some education about volunteer geographic information or volunteer geographical data would also boost the availability of such data and also the capacity of city government to use such techniques to estimate land values and increase revenue mobilization. So let me end here. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Felix, for that presentation. Super fascinating paper. So yeah, just switching gears on to the Q&A section of this recording. So first, just jumping in, let me start zooming out, I guess, bigger picture. You opened by arguing that the geography of urban land values is pretty foundational for urban science, for, you say, revenue mobilization, for basically any form of land-based financing in these cities. But yet the sort of paradox is most African cities, that information essentially doesn't exist, or it's outdated, it's partial, it's blocked or locked behind proprietary walls. before we get into the methods and the nuances of the paper, just high level, when a city government doesn't know what its urban land value is worth, like what concretely can't it do? What does that cost to these cities in terms of, this urbanization for growth agenda that you and I both care about?
Yes, thank you very much, Curtis. So if city governments can't quantify the actual values of their lands, and unfortunately, that is the case in many African cities where urbanization is taking place rapidly. What urbanization means, you have land values increasing, and if city government can't quantify the value, it also means it can't capture the correct value. So what that means is city governments are underselling themselves and are not generating the much needed resources to finance infrastructure. So what that ultimately leads to is worsen living conditions. We need infrastructure to improve living conditions. People need to access basic amenities and infrastructural services, and all these require money to fund them. Infrastructure needs to be provided or needs to be financed. So if city governments are more able to quantify the actual values of land, that it means they are not able to generate the correct values, and they are under generating revenue, and that means they wouldn't have the much needed resources to finance the infrastructure that is needed in African cities to improve living conditions. So the people that would end up suffering are actually the people that live in the cities, Africans, the normal people that spend their lives in the cities. It means they would have less infrastructure, less amenities, less important services, or poor quality of infrastructural amenities and services, because the governments are not generating the much needed resources or money to finance the infrastructure. So it's not just a problem of not being able to quantify the value of land, but it's also a problem of not being able to finance the much needed infrastructure, which then leads to deteriorated living conditions in African cities. So it's an important one.
Yeah. And I, on the sort of outcome sort of variable that you care about, the target variable, that's a foundational choice of the paper. You guys squarely target sort of monthly rent per square meter. That's built from this web scraped online listings in both of the cities, Accra and Nairobi. I think it's called Two Nation in Accra and Buy Rent Kenya in Nairobi. So one thing I think it'd be good for listeners to understand, online listings, and you touched upon this in the presentation briefly, so I just wanted you to expand upon it. Online listings are sort of by construction, the formal, the advertised, the often higher end slice of the urban housing market in these cities. And in African cities where a lot of the residents live in informal or unadvertised housing, how worried should we be that you may be training on sort of the visible tip of the housing market and then asking the model to predict the whole sort of iceberg beneath that itty bitty small formalized tip?
Yes, thank you. That is an important question. So before applying the model, we assess the quality of the spatial coverage of the web scraped online property listings. So we geocode that. Then we look at the coverage, especially paying attention to the low income areas. So we look at the distribution and also the variance in the web scraped rental prices. That is it just the high end market, or we have enough representation from a low end market as well. So before using the model, we actually do that. And in this case, we realized that in both Accra and Nairobi, interestingly, we still have quite a lot of property listings coming from the low income areas. So if we show a map of the geolocated property listings, you see in the case of Nairobi, some located very close to Kibera. But of course, in terms of quantities, there are a lot more property listings coming from the high end than from the lower end. So before using the model, we do what we call before developing this machine learning model, we do what we call spatial interpolation. So we try to estimate for the areas that we have sparse data by using the limited data, basically to generate for the areas that we don't have enough data. So we try to account for that really. But surprisingly, the online market data in terms of its coverage, spatial coverage, we have significant amount coming from low income areas than you would actually realize. But we also do understand that there are a lot more transactions within low income areas that are not captured digitally, that are not online. It's just estate agents using boards to advertise, and that is why we need to improve the approach going forward, how to bring in a lot more data from the low income areas. But as it stands now, we have some representation of the low income areas. Thank you.
Okay. And this next one is more out of my curiosity, and it might be requesting you to speculate a bit, and feel free to do so. I won't hold you to the answer. I wanted to know roughly, and this can be like a back of the envelope calculation, like how much would you estimate like this approach would cut the cost and the time of creating like an updated valuation role for property in a average African city, and like compared to the costs of setting up a sort of conventional surveyor-led or valuer-led approach. And again, feel free to speculate. I know you don't have these numbers like precisely estimated on the top of your head, but yeah, I wanted to ask just to get a sense of magnitudes.
I think the answer is right in there. That I don't have the numbers on top of my head, but in terms of speculation, I'll speculate in terms of percentages. I would say this approach would be not less than 10 times cheaper than the traditional approach of conducting surveys and using surveys to estimate land values, even so for very limited areas. The AI bit, which might sound complicated or complex for some listeners, actually with a standard computer with 16 gig RAM, it took less than 10 minutes to run the AI model and the deep learning model that extracts the satellite features. So, and all of the input data are open data as well, so freely accessible. Not pay anything for that. It would take few hours, if not less than an hour, even for an average computer to generate or estimate land values once you have the input data, from the open sources for a city like Accra or Nairobi. So in terms of magnitude, I would say it would be about not less than 10 times cheaper than traditional approaches. So our approach in terms of its cost is extremely low, not less than 10 times, I would say.
Okay, so this is good. This feeds into my next question, right? So you have this new approach given new recent advances in technologies that is like at least an order of magnitude cheaper than the status quo approach to property valuation in these cities. So very low cost, at least relative to the default, seemingly replicable, right? Again, you stress local context. You need to train the model on different cities, but there's a framework for training that model that's replicable, that are implementable even at sort of low administrative capacity levels that we observe in many African cities, and scalable. The list goes on. Why aren't we seeing this methodology or something like it diffusing and increasingly being used? Or, I mean, you can push back and say, hey, we are seeing this diffuse, but I haven't been seeing it diffuse, right? And this is especially kind of confusing and a bit baffling to me, that these sorts of very cheap, like at least an order of magnitude cheaper approaches to estimating land values aren't diffusing more rapidly, because we're in especially a precarious sort of fiscal situation with many African governments finding themselves sort of cash strapped in the post 2025 world with sort of massive cuts in aid that adversely impact their budgets. So like if you had to, pinpoint the top 1, 2, 3 answers as to why we aren't seeing these types of methodologies, given how cheap they are relative to the status quo diffusing, what would those reasons be?
That's a good one. What comes on top of my mind would be digital development still not at a stage. So a lot of African cities are lagging behind digital development in general. So you would realize these are digital techniques. So digital development generally, in terms of its level and its nature, is quite low in many African cities. So as a result of that, they are not able to tap into these emerging digital solutions, digital technologies. So the general digital space, it's something that needs to be developed much further. Like I mentioned, the online housing market, its development is quite nascent, it's quite recent, really. It's very young, albeit it's getting better, and that links to the status of digital development in general. There are lots of countries that are taking the digitalization seriously, Ghana included, Kenya included. So with digitalization, taking place in many African cities, I think it's just natural that some of these technologies will become much more available to city government and administrators, and then also the capacity of local planning authorities or city government is also quite low for many African cities. This, I would describe this approach as being simple, but for many local planning authorities, or for many city governments, the capacity to be able to implement such an approach isn't there. It's one that needs to be consciously developed, even though it wouldn't take a lot of resources developing that capacity. With a bit of effort, that capacity can be developed, and also awareness and knowledge. The whole point of this research is that there is this technique that could be used in this way that has not been used before. So these techniques are quite new, and give it the next decade or so, will become more common knowledge, more rampant, and hopefully it would reflect in cities in Africa. We'll see implementation of some of these new techniques. So one, the techniques are new. Two, local capacities need to be consciously developed. And three, the state of digital development in many African cities is quite low. And I think on top of my head, these are the three reasons that I could ascribe.
Yeah. What about, I want to, because I come from sort of political economy background, so I always think about the underlying politics, and sort of in any given reform, typically reforms involve both winners and losers, right? And you could, if we speculated, come up with who those losers might be in the instance of more accurately valuing urban land across African cities that are fast growing. I think probably slum landlords wouldn't like this. There's some baked in incentive that some of these slum landlords perhaps would like to see the slums continue to remain largely informal, so they can continue to benefit from the ongoing stream of rents that they get from this land that they collect rents from. Have you thought about the political opposition to this? And the next question, beyond thinking about who these potential losers are, is, how can these losers be compensated in a way that reforms would be incentive compatible and we could actually get these reforms through, right? And to me, the value, the benefit of formalizing and having accurate urban land values so massively outweighs any sort of one-off ad hoc cost to some of these, a group of these slum landlords, that you could easily think of a way to make this incentive compatible such that the losers are compensated, sort of everybody wins and is behind reform. Yeah. This is me speculating, but like from my political economy background, I think about who's losing. In your estimation, because you know this area deeper than I, who are these kind of political losers, and is there any effort to sort of get them less losing or even benefiting from this, such that they're more united behind reform, and this diffuses more rapidly?
Yeah, I mean, Curtis, political economy is more in your area, and I agree to what you said, that to every action, especially the politics of it, you'd have losers and you have winners. In this instance, leveraging this approach, which is low-cost approach of estimating land values, and the benefit that comes with it, it's so overwhelming that the losers, I would argue, will be fewer. There'll be much more winners. And a stakeholder engagement process where, okay, we don't say that because the losers are few, we leave them behind, but rather engage them right from the outset, let them know how they also stand to benefit, really. Like I mentioned earlier on, our inability to capture land values correctly impact living conditions overall. For me, that is the overall impact. Living conditions are worsened. So if city government could make a case how living conditions could be improved, how people's conditions could be improved, I think they'll get buy-in, they'll get a social acceptability, overwhelmingly, to sort of implement some of these innovative approaches to estimating land values and boosting revenue mobilization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess you could say there could be a similar incentive system or incentive compatible like reward set up even to get folks to contribute more voluntary data, because you said that was one of the barriers as well. Perhaps if they got something for contributing this data, like people get on YouTube from like posting a really viral video, they benefit sort of materially from that, perhaps. So on to some other questions. So like one of the most striking findings, to me at least, is kind of how differently the two cities behaved, right? So let's dig into that a bit. The predictor, the importances, the signs flip in some instances. So like I think population density, road density, radiance are positively associated with rent in Accra, but negatively associated with rent in Nairobi. And you went over this in your presentation. This is sort of genuine context specificity, like different urban forms, different kind of spatial structures and urban histories. But like let's think about a bigger skeptic and what they might say. Maybe they might say perhaps these sign flips are what we would expect from two separately tuned random forest models, kind of maybe overfitting to a few thousand like slightly noisy online listings in each of the cities. How do you know that you're capturing the real structural differences between these two cities rather than some of that more noisy stuff that always comes with kind of online listings and using this sort of publicly accessible, as you said, slightly messy data that needs to be cleaned?
So to start with, the relationship we're seeing is not coming from random forests. Random forests could not potentially be overestimating that. So that is coming from simple correlation, Pearson's correlation analysis of the relationship between the variables, and not all the variables are really coming from online listings. So it's only the property, it's only the rental price that is coming from the online listings. The other variables coming from OSM, of course, also has its own challenges. I would say perhaps a lot more research will be needed to really understand why we're observing that differences. But like you mentioned, history plays a role. the three variables, actually the four variables, population, radiance, road density, are actually all capturing population. So you realize that. So radiance, for instance, so nighttime light largely captures population. There are a lot more research to that sort of effect. Road density also tends to be higher in areas where you have a lot more people. So then what that means is population density, right? So we observe the relationship where, in the case of Nairobi, the denser areas tends to have lower rental price than the less dense areas, whereas Accra is the opposite. Perhaps in the case of Nairobi, the type of housing we see, what does denser areas look like? Denser areas perhaps are less appealing or attractive to higher income, groups or higher income class. So you could think of potential theories to explain that. There are plausible reasons to sort of, explain that. But I would say we need, further research to dig into why we're observing those differences, in terms of relationship between rent and the predictors. But broadly, you would expect to see some differences because of history, because of building typology, and also attractions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to give you my very off the cuff speculative conjecture here on the difference, and it could have something to. I don't know if you've read Henderson and from LSE, Vernon Henderson from LSE, and a few co-authors. It's called Colonial Legacy: Shaping African Cities. I think Journal of Economic Geography. This might be like in settler cities during colonial times, like Nairobi. There was kind of a lot of settlers. I think there was many more relative to there were in Accra. You can push back on that, Felix. You know the Ghanaian history much better than I do. But proportionally, I think there were more settlers in Nairobi than Accra. And I think where that was the case in British colonies, at least, there would tend to be a lot more like leaning into like sort of greenfield, garden planning, like sort of Ebenezer Howard-esque, like leafy suburbs that were just less dense for these, expats or Brits living in these more settler-oriented cities. And so that may have then long-term consequences for urban land values. People perceive like those areas are higher status because these used to be the expat enclaves where those rich people lived. And that like perception persists in land value prices into the future. Very off the cuff, sort of hand wavy theory, but that's sort of what immediately occurred to me when I saw this weird sign change between Nairobi and Accra. What do you think?
I mean, it could be, like I mentioned earlier, and I would say perhaps, you do further research. Also, you have further research to sort of investigate that phenomenon, better. In the case of Accra, there are a lot more enclaves that are closer to the city center, which tends to have, higher population. So centrally, the city has higher population. The centers tend to be more, dense. And then as you move outward, it becomes less denser. There are a lot more enclaves in the denser areas that have high land value. So cantonments in Accra, even Osu, there are parts of Osu that are very, expensive. East Legon in Accra, Jowolo in Accra, those are areas that are in the center, part of the high density center, but also highly expensive. In the case of Nairobi, it seems the trend is quite different. That that the suburbs, the more slightly peripheral areas relative to the central core, appears to be more attractive to higher income class. So from my standpoint, I wouldn't interpret the differences in the relationships as weird. I would rather say, let's dig further to understand the mechanisms by which the relationship expresses itself.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And two more questions and then we'll wrap up. First, I wanted to situate this against like the rest of the space and sort of urban land valuation. There's the Ali Dinninger Wild work using sort of imagery for tax maps. There's like the deliberately low-tech, simplified valuation approaches, like points-based valuation was used, for example, to great effect in Freetown, Sierra Leone, to significantly increase property tax take and widen the tax net. Where does this methodology that you and Sean Fox outline in this paper that yet leverages open data and machine learning, where does it sit in this broader landscape of different methodologies and approaches to valuation? Like basically, right, we're a policy lab, so I'm thinking, when should a city official at an agency reach for these sort of open data machine learning approaches like yours? When perhaps is it better to think about some of these other approaches like this simplified points-based valuation methodology? What are the main differences and trade-offs between those two methods? Or do you see them as complements rather than substitutes? Those types of things would be great to understand, especially as policymakers or practitioners.
Yes, I would say if you're looking at city scale, land value estimation, then you want to be looking at our methods, because city scale it becomes difficult to replicate or to scale up some of these methods that you mentioned, point-based valuation for limited areas, very small areas. If you're looking at a citywide and even go beyond one city, then of course you will need a method that is scalable, that is also simple, and at the same time is low cost. So all the input data we use in our method is open source. So that makes it more scalable. And the data is available for many cities, albeit at different quality. So I would say first assess the data situation of your city. If the online housing market data appears to be quite good, if OSM data coverage appears to be decent, as for the satellite imagery, it's there for every city, because you have satellite in the in the atmosphere capturing photos of the entire globe, of the entire Earth, right? So whichever city you are in, you have satellite data available. So the availability of data, which then tilts heavily towards our method, because the data is largely available. Satellite data, daytime satellite data, likewise nighttime satellite data available. Population data, it's available for all cities. World Pop, for instance, has population data available for all the cities in the world that is graded. So most of the data sets you would require from it is already there. It's the online property listings with the online housing market bit. You assess your city if that is decent, alongside the OpenStreetMap data bit. If that is so decent, then you pretty much go to use our method, which can be applied on a large scale, really.
Correct me if you want to push back on this, but like I see your method sort of, it declines in viability as a function like really of city size. So like the larger cities are going to have probably better quality online listings, right? And I think that quality of online listings is going to sort of pretty precipitously fall as you get smaller and smaller sort of secondary and like even tertiary cities. And that could change, over time. But in 2026, some of these smaller cities, like when you get below 500,000 people, I don't think they just have the quality of online listings that might require, and that could change. But do you would you? I mean,
I would agree. I would agree with that. Generally, if you look at the landscape of online housing market, it appears that the bigger cities have better data than the smaller cities. So in that context, like I said earlier on, that you assess the data availability. So which methods require what data, and what data do you have, right? That would also inform the method to use. So if you assess, first of all, that you have decent housing online housing data, then of course you use that. But I agree with you that for many small cities with population less than 500,000, the online housing market is virtually non-existent.
scanned.
Then in those cases, then you use other methods. Even for bigger cities, the methods could be used, in a complementary way. If you do a point-based assessment or even traditional surveys, for limited areas, you could use that to improve the accuracy or the performance of the model. Because you could always fine-tune the model, you could always improve the parameters of the model. So once we have more surveys, we don't treat it as, separate, but rather use the survey as a validation layer or as a training layer to even refine the model.
Right.
So in the long run, I see a convergence of these methods. And as we get more data for even smaller cities with regards to the online housing market, we might have a method that is applicable regardless of city size. And that would appear to be a convergence of these different methods.
Yeah. And even you mentioned the complementarity of sort of surveys and ground truthing to calibrate and feed into the model. They, like the folks at LOGRI, Local Government Revenue Initiative, that sort of champion this points-based valuation approach. They also they do a lot of surveys and ground truthing at a small scale to calibrate the algorithm that spits out the points per property. So I think you're totally right. I think these methods are complementary, and sort of each will be used in order to get more accurate pictures of valuation over time. Okay, last question, Felix. Then this is a forward-looking one. If you had sort of no resource constraints, you had the dream data set, you had a willing city government partner, what is the next paper or the next addition to the tool that you'd built on top of what you and Sean went over in this paper? What would you most want, like a finance minister or city revenue authority watching this recording to take away and act on?
So I would say the potential has been demonstrated. There is a huge potential for this low-cost, scalable method to boost revenue mobilization in cities in Africa, in cities that have data problems. So I would say embrace this method, look into it more at a bare minimum, and it could at least generate the first cut, valuation to then compare with whatever methods you have, and to a bit of ground truthing, limited ground truthing, and that could significantly improve revenue mobilization in many cities in Africa. So I would say the potential is there. Look into it, and those are opened. If you have more questions about further developing the method, I'm happy to answer that. But going forward, I would say it's about time we look forward. We look into these methods and invest some time and a bit a bit more resources. Wouldn't require a lot more resources, but some local capacity building, training in digital technology, in some of these modeling techniques, to then yield much bigger gain in terms of generating the much needed revenue for financing infrastructure. Thanks.
Yeah. And even, Felix, even your, granted speculative, but your estimate on at least an order of magnitude, at least a 10x decrease in costs relative to status quo methods of valuation, I think that should juice up a lot of minds to get thinking about these alternative models that incorporate the latest technologies, because that fundamentally changes the viability and should change the sort of business model and financial viability of these approaches. So great paper. Before we close, if listeners, they're watching this and they want to learn more about your work or dig into your broader research agenda, other than the Africa Urban Lab website, where can they find you? Do you have your own website? Do you have a sort of social following or LinkedIn or what? Where can they find you and learn more?
So for my name in Google, Felix Sajiman, you find a lot more about me. I'm with the University of Manchester, lecturer in spatial data science. You would find more about my my profile from the University of Manchester website, which if you put my name in Google, that's going to pop up. I'm also on LinkedIn. If you search Felix Agyemang on LinkedIn, you're going to see my name pop up. Feel free to reach out, send a message, and I'll be happy to respond. I'm also on ResearchGate. So if you're a researcher and you want to reach out, that's also fine. And my email is also in this presentation, felix.agyemang@manchester.ac.uk. Thanks very much.
Awesome. Well, that's all I had. As I said at the beginning, I'm Curtis Lockhart, founder and executive director of the Africa Urban Lab. You can learn more about the AUL's work at www.aul.city, or you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow us on Twitter at Africa Urban Lab. Felix, thank you so much for this. We really appreciate you joining us.
Thanks for having me, Curtis.